Thank you for watching. This is Connor Johnson, and today I'll be going over wired versus wireless networks and just kind of discuss some of the different advantages and disadvantages of each and how they can apply to different companies and so forth. So, starting off, we're going to be talking about some of the differences between each of these network types. For wired, what you have to know about wired is that you usually have to go through and connect it via cables for the different PCs and devices that are on the network. One of the advantages to this is that you can get a much more consistent signal because one of the problems with wireless is that sometimes you can get dropped off the network, and that can lead to issues if you're trying to go through and turn something in, if you're trying to work on a project, but you can't connect to the internet. But one of the disadvantages to a wired network is the lack of mobility. With wireless, you can go through, you can move around with, say, your iPad or whatnot around your house or around the school, whatever. But with wired, you can't do that as effectively because the computer has to have a port that can be plugged into or just an outlet in the wall. But the reliability of wired is really the biggest strength to take away from this. And also, another important note is that switch ports are usually dedicated to your network, whereas with a wireless, you share it. Because with routers for wireless, usually you'll have multiple devices connected at once. Whereas with wired, physically, you can have two cables connected in one port. It's just not going to work, right? But for a wireless, usually this is good for mobility because it allows devices to not have to use wires in order to connect with the internet. Also, a very good point is that it's just much more cost effective for wireless because all the wires and all the costs you would go into that, you don't have to sync in the long run. You can just get wireless routers, set them up, and then use your devices to connect. But when you go through, you have to be careful with computers because sometimes that can lead to security issues. But another disadvantage is that you have to be close enough to the router in order for it to pick up the signal. So you would have to usually be in the same building and whatnot. There is a cutoff to how the signal, how far the signal can go. You can go through and you can get like an extender, but usually that can only spread out so much farther. So usually it's best to be in within the limits. But speed can also suffer from this issue on distance whenever you're trying to connect with like a laptop or whatnot. But moving on to the OS model, what's important to recognize here is this is how information gets from one computer to another. So depending on if you're the sender or the receiver, depends on where you start on this model. For example, if you're sending something, you'll start at the physical layer and then move up to application. But if you were receiving, usually the packets will start at application and then they'll move down to physical. But for the first two layers, we'll be focusing on the physical and the data. So for the physical layer, what happens here is that the data will travel through the physical devices, like the routers, the switches, the wires, yeah, in order to get where they're going. But that is until it reaches the data link layer, where it goes through, and it will attach an address so that it's much easier to go through and like track where all the data is supposed to go. Because for the fact you have so many packets, it's very easy for things to get confused. But if there's a constant address to be sent to, it's much easier to keep track of. So for security risks, both can have security risks. So it's very important to understand and tailor how you approach security for which system. Starting off with the wireless, uh, the information is much more vulnerable because the connection, since it's not over like a physical wire, it's much easier to intercept. Usually, what you'll want to do is you'll want to try to configure the uh, the router so that it's not as easy to. And then also, it's good to make sure you encrypt the data. We'll get into that a little bit later. But for wire, it's much easier to keep things secure because everything being physical, you can decide which switch ports to plug into. And then also for switch ports that aren't turned on, it's easy to go through and prevent, say, a hacker if they get into the building. If the switch port is off, then they can't plug in their own computer. That's a common issue some people have. They'll forget to turn off the ports they're not using. But for both, it's also really good to attach firewalls and set those up, and then other basic security measure, just so that if a hacker goes try to attack, it's easier to figure out, and also just to prevent them from succeeding. And then a part of the another advantage to the wired system is that everything is much more physical. So while they can still go through and do virtual attacks on your system, like a denial of service attack, if they were going to go through and do an attack that maybe requires much more knowledge and so forth, they'd have to get involved with like the physical devices. So it makes wired a much more secure system. However, with security, also is a trade off with convenience that the wireless system has. So, some of the unique attributes to wireless. Uh, of, of course, one of the main ones we've continued to talk about is the lack of wires. It just makes everything look much cleaner around the office and so forth. Also, for network updates, you can go through and have it so that it can increase speeds of the other router, which can make it a lot easier to go through than to go physically update it. Also, with speed, you can increase it by having multiple routers within the building. That way, if one of the routers drops, you can always connect to another one, and that they don't all have to be sharing like one router has to go through and all the computers to it. It can kind of share the burden. It also makes it very scalable having a wireless system, as seen in the graph over here. You can connect things like laptops, smartphones, TVs, uh, things like that. Make it a lot more easier because rather than having to go through and pay for all the wires and having to go through and punch holes in all the walls, you can just connect from it by just setting it up on the smartphone or laptop or whatnot, and then just type in the passwords and so forth. Another thing to understand is that encryption is usually one of the safest ways to secure your data wireless network. There are a couple different types. There's WPA and then WPA2, which replace the original. Usually people will go through and use WPA2 because it's the latest and greatest in terms of encryption. Also, or another reminder just to configure devices correctly. Many attackers have been successful due to just basic, uh, for like people will go through and they'll just forget to go through and set up basic like firewalls and so forth, or they'll forget to turn off a switch port or whatnot. So it's just always good to go through and just double check yourself and the commands you pumped in. Also, another good recommendation is to hire a penetration tester, go through and check the network for any of those flaws you might have missed. It's kind of like a teacher overlooking your homework before you turn it in. It's not cheap, but um, in the long run, it might be cheaper. Also, you can go through and on a wireless, you can limit the signal so that it doesn't leave the building. But sometimes hackers will go through and try to connect to the system. And if it's not within the building, then that's just a little bit easier for them. So you'll want to go through and make sure that limit that space. Also, specific devices and telling the router which ones can connect to the network and not connect to the network. That's very important to allow that. All right. Well, here's all of the citations for this PowerPoint. Thank you for listening, and hope you have a nice day. Thank you for listening and